So today I'm going to talk with you about Ibogaine treatment for opioid use disorder, and I want to start with a little bit of my own history in terms of how I got into this and how I started, but also then go into the history of Ibogaine treatment and how that developed around the world. Then I'm going to look at some evidence for efficacy of Ibogaine treatment, and really focus, of course, on the study that I did a few years ago and that was recently published. And then I will go into some discussion of what can be done to improve Ibogaine treatment and where are things lacking right now. And if I have time at the end, what I'll do is I've got a few pithy quotes from some of the participants in the study that will show you how transformative these experiences are for them. All right, so starting it off, this is a picture taken in Playa de Tijuana, Mexico in 2009. And pictured here are Sandy Hartman and her canine companion, Yuppie. The reason I have Sandy pictured here, she became a good friend, and she's the first person I interviewed when I started doing research on Ibogaine. She had recently gotten treated for substance dependence, actually on opioids, at a clinic in Baja California. And she had driven across, a few months earlier, she had driven across the country. She came from Tennessee, which is on the eastern seaboard, and drove with her dog across the country to California and then down into Mexico. And for her 60th birthday, she gave herself an Ibogaine treatment. She'd been dependent on opioids for about 12 years in the aftermath of an automobile accident. And she tried to get off of them but couldn't. The Ibogaine treatment worked so well for her that she was able to be abstinent from opioids for the rest of her life, which, as it turned out, was only 5 more years, but her quality of life was much improved as compared to what it would have been. And then she also started providing aftercare treatment and integration treatment for people undergoing Ibogaine treatment. So I owe a lot to Sandy for getting me interested in this work to begin with. This is a chart from the United States, data on overdose deaths involving opioids by type of opioid. Now, you can see that there's this recent spike in opioid-related deaths in the US. And I don't have the data for Sweden, but I've just looked it up on the internet. And the Karolinska Institute did a study, I think in 2015, which shows also a recent spike in opioid-related deaths in Sweden. So this is a problem that's happening in a lot of places around the world. And what do we have to deal with it? The main treatment we have for opioid addiction is opioid replacement therapy, which essentially is replacing the problem substance, for example, heroin, with a substance that is illegal, that is not as euphoric, and that is usually longer acting, such as methadone or buprenorphine. And the principle behind this is that you replace the opioid with something else that's going to keep you from going into withdrawal. And you will gradually be weaned off. You'll reduce your doses, and eventually you'll go down to 0, and you won't be on opioids anymore. The big problem with this is that most people don't make it that far. And if they do, it can take 7 to 12 years on average for people to go from the beginning of treatment to completing that treatment and not being on opioids anymore. And for a lot of people, that's basically the rest of their lives because of the higher risk of mortality for opioid users. So there are some other problems as well with ORT. One is the dropout rate. So a Cochrane review, which is a very comprehensive review of the literature, recently published this data that just 5 months after starting treatment, over 1/3 of methadone patients and almost half of buprenorphine patients will drop out of the treatment program. And that's basically a failure, right? So they're no longer on their maintenance drug. And worse yet, the relapse rates are very high. So if someone is detoxed, if they use these things short term to get off of the problem opioid, then they relapse within the first few months. And in fact, after about a month and a half, this is again based on a review of the literature, with methadone, only about 1/4 are abstinent after 1.5 months. And with buprenorphine, it's only about 1/5 are abstinent after 4 weeks or so. So big problems there. Now, I'm talking today about Ibogaine treatment, which we wouldn't have probably if it weren't for this man, Howard Lotsof. But Ibogaine treatment is something that typically is only done once, and it lasts for a few days, maybe a few weeks, but it's typically a few days. And sometimes this works so well that the person doesn't have to have treatment again. They're just abstinent from opioids. And as we'll see, usually people do relapse, but compared to standard treatment, the numbers look pretty good, and this is something that doesn't have to be maintained over a long period of time. So Howard Lotsof, in 1962, he was 19 years old, living in New York City, and he was part of a group of lay drug experimenters. And he was offered by a chemist friend of his, he was offered some Ibogaine HCl. The guy said, it'll give you a 30-hour trip, but it takes 7 hours to come on. So, it'll take a while, but then you have a 30-hour trip. So Lotsof thinks to himself, okay, it's going to take a long time to come on. I've got my therapy appointment today. I'll take the Ibogaine, then I'll go to my therapy appointment, then I'll have plenty of time for it to come on later. Turns out that it came on within an hour, and he was on his way to the therapy appointment and started seeing visions, like multiple visions of himself and other really intense visions. And he got to the therapy appointment, and he walks in the door and says, hey, I'm on Ibogaine. Turn on your tape recorder and record this, So then after the appointment, he has these intense visions for another 6 or 8 hours. And then 23 hours in, after he's had the intense visions and everything, he's back home, and he's totally exhausted. And he thinks to himself, why would anybody ever take this stuff? I'm going to sleep for 2 weeks. And he goes to bed. Turns out he only sleeps for 3 hours. And he wakes up totally refreshed, and decides he's going to walk out into the street and go for a walk in Brooklyn. And once he gets down to the street, he has this sudden realization that he is not experiencing withdrawal symptoms. He'd been a daily user of heroin, and he was not experiencing any withdrawal symptoms, nor was he experiencing any cravings for heroin. So he says, about 23 hours, well after the intense visions have passed, he said, why in the world, when they take this? Oh, I'm going to fast forward here. So he says, I stopped dead in my tracks once I got to the street. I stopped dead in my tracks in the street and suddenly realized that I was not in heroin withdrawal. And immediately after I realized I wasn't in heroin withdrawal, I realized that my perception towards heroin had entirely changed. Where previously I viewed heroin as a drug which gave me comfort, I now viewed heroin as a drug which emulated death. The very next thought in my mind was, I prefer life to death. And he eventually made Ibogaine treatment his life's work, and led a growing activist treatment provider movement starting in the late 80s, or the mid 80s actually. So what is Ibogaine? Let's look at that. You see the structure here, which is kind of a crazy structure, but it's a psychoactive indole alkaloid, and it's found in the inner root bark. It's concentrated in the inner root bark of the Iboga shrub, which is indigenous to West Central Africa. There's a picture of the shrub there. And here's a picture of a man who's shaving the outer bark off so we can get to the inner bark, which is where this alkaloid and the other 11 alkaloids are concentrated. And these shavings are eaten in large quantities in initiatory rituals and in smaller quantities for other purposes. And here's a picture of a few different rituals in Gabon, where the Bwiti religion has grown up, which is really about the Iboga ritual. These rituals are typically overnight or last for a couple of days, and the initiate consumes a very large amount of the root bark and travels to the land of the dead and is commonly has encounters with ancestral spirits. So this quote at the top is from James Hernandez, who is an anthropologist who studied the Bwiti religion. He said the Iboga visions are an important part of the breaking open of the head and the opening up to the fuller possibilities of self and of universe. And in this ritual, the initiate is to endure a process of death and rebirth, and is given a new name and basically a new identity within the group. All right, so in Gabon, in recognition of how important it was for the Bwiti, and also how important it was becoming for Ibogaine treatment around the world, they declared Iboga a national treasure in 2000. In contrast, so 1962, Howard Lotsof makes that discovery, and in the late 60s in the US, Ibogaine was made illegal as part of the kind of psychedelic counterculture. It was put on a long list of drugs that were made illegal, and also it's put on Schedule 1, which is the most restrictive schedule in the United States. And several European countries followed suit, and now you have the situation where it's illegal in many places and unregulated in most places around the world. So in the late 80s, in part because of what Howard Lotsof was doing, there were some preclinical animal studies that were done with ibogaine and some related compounds, noribogaine and 18-MC, which showed that ibogaine was effective. These three compounds were all effective in having animals reduce self-administration of drugs and also in attenuating withdrawal-like symptoms. In the late 80s also, ibogaine treatments began in the Netherlands and also in New York City. Okay. Oh, there we go. Here's a picture of an apartment in Rotterdam. This is one of the site of some of the earliest treatments. This is a picture from 1990. You see Howard and Norma Lotsof standing outside with the treatment provider there. And so this is one of the alternative settings where the treatments first began. So around that time, there was increasingly strong activism in the Netherlands and in New York City, where treatments were being done underground, to try to get ibogaine treatment recognized and to try to get some research permission and funding for it. And eventually, in 1991, Howard Lotsof actually had some data. He and some colleagues presented the data to the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the US, and they influenced them to undertake an ibogaine project, which unfortunately was abandoned about 4 years later. But also during that period, in the mid-90s to 2000, ibogaine treatment became more and more available worldwide and in other countries in alternative settings. Here's another one of those alternative settings. This is also from the Netherlands, a hotel room in Amsterdam where some of the early treatments took place, and you can see it's a pretty bare hotel room, but this is where a lot of the early treatments took place, in people's apartments and hotel rooms and so on. But eventually, treatment sites evolved into being more elaborate for the most part. Here's a picture of somebody at an Ibogaine rally, Ibogaine testing now, a rally in New York City in 1993. And by 2006, this growing movement had resulted in there being treatment sites on 4 continents. Here's a map of a world map of the treatment sites that existed in February of 2006. And this is from a paper called The Ibogaine Medical Subculture, which was co-authored by Howard Lotsof, Ken Alper, and Charlie Kaplan, and showing where these treatment sites are. This is, at this point also, around 2005, was when science writer Brian Bestag referred to the Ibogaine movement as a vast, uncontrolled experiment because it was unregulated and sprouting up in different places. So that same paper that I just mentioned, Alper and colleagues, it was a very comprehensive and thorough ethnography of the different Ibogaine treatment sites, and they looked to see how many treatments had been done with Ibogaine around the world. And they measured it up to 2001 and then up to February 2006. And you can see the numbers there increasing, and they estimated that that represents an annual growth rate of 30% of the number of treatments per year. So it's growing rapidly at this point. And by 2014, this map is based on, so that's 2006. Let me just go back to that. So this is the 2006 map I just showed you. And this is from a kind of quick and dirty study that I did in March of 2014, where I found that there were 35 to 50 treatment sites. It was hard to contact some people. It wasn't a really thorough effort on my part, but I found 35 sites that existed, and there were maybe 15 or 20 others that I thought might well exist at that point. The red ones are ones in countries that already had Ibogaine treatment 8 years earlier. The blue ones are in countries that did not have Ibogaine treatment 8 years earlier, and the green ones are in countries that by that point had legalized Ibogaine treatment, and those countries are Brazil, South Africa, and New Zealand. And fast forward to 3 years later, just last summer, there were about 80 treatment sites around the world. So you can see that the rate of growth of this Ibogaine treatment movement is still very, very rapid. All right. So there was a lot of anecdotal evidence for the efficacy of Ibogaine treatment, but there really wasn't much research into it. So there has been a real great need to show that it's effective so that we can convince the medical and scientific communities that it's worth studying further and possibly worth turning into a legally available treatment. Prior to 2014, there were just 3 published studies on Ibogaine. One paper, which was a case series of 33 treatments, showed that there was full resolution of withdrawal symptoms in 88% of the population. There was also an open-label prospective study, which used rating scales to show the resolution of withdrawal scales and symptoms at 24 hours, and also showed sustained improvement in depression scores at 1 month following treatment. There's also a study that just had 3 case studies, one for opioid dependence. So this is why we initiated some studies into Ibogaine efficacy, and this one was one that I undertook starting in 2010, and my colleague Ken Alper and I wrote up the results, and it was published online in 2017. You can find it online thanks to MAPS, who funded the study, and also it just got published in print in January of this year. So in this study, we asked 3 questions about efficacy. First question was, is Ibogaine effective in opioid detoxification? And this is the short-term efficacy. Is it really effective in reducing the withdrawal symptoms that you'd ordinarily get if you stopped using opioids? And for this one, we use something called SOWS. It's the Subjective Opioid Withdrawal Scale, which is a measure that's completed by the person who's undergoing treatment. We had them do it before treatment and then after treatment. And before treatment, well, to explain this instrument a little bit more, there are 16 questions where the person rates him or herself on the severity of withdrawal symptoms from 0 to 4. So the lowest score you could have is 0, and the highest is 64 if your symptoms are very intense. So here are the results, and this is a graph showing the before and after of all 28 people that we had do this. There were 30 people enrolled in the study, but we had lost the data at the clinics for 2 people. But this is the 27 people who we had before and after scores for. And you can see that for 24 of them, the scores went down quite a lot. And 3 of them went up, which is interesting too. But the pre-treatment SOWS scores decreased quite significantly in the period following treatment. So we essentially said yes to that question. And this is a quick slide showing our results on the left, that same chart you just saw, and on the right, that is a graph from the original paper describing the development of the SOWS instrument. And what that shows is that if you look at our results versus theirs, the one on the left in the second chart, that one that's kind of in the middle of the slide, that's showing people who are only opioid users. On the right side, it's people who are polysubstance users plus opioids, right? So you can see that that's a little more mixed in the results. And it looks a lot like our data. And this is people who are detoxed with methadone. So our results compare very favorably with the detox from methadone, which is, as I was mentioning, a replacement opioid. So the second question we asked was a treatment effect evident at 1 month after treatment? And for this one, we used something called the Addiction Severity Index, or ASI, which has 7 different subscales, including drug and alcohol use, and also some employment and family and social status, psychiatric status, and all these scores are severity scores, so the higher scores indicate a more problematic severity level, and the scores range from 0 to 1. So here are results at 1 month with the different ASI subscores. The ASIC is ASI composite score in the different areas, and you can see that at baseline to 1 month post-treatment, the scores in 4 areas have gone down considerably. With drug use and family and social status, the scores have gone down quite substantially, and also in legal status they've gone down, And psychiatric status is 0.052, so it's kind of borderline on there. I'm going to rush through these slides because it's got a 10-minute warning. So this is a spaghetti plot of all the results from our study in the drug subscore, and you can see the time course of these scores from baseline out to, we measured it 3, 6, 9, and 12 months in addition to the 1 month time point, and you can see how those scores go. Looking at 1 month, this is where you see the ASI composite drug scores going down from pre-treatment to 1 month. So the other question we asked is whether or not a treatment effect was observed at 1 month. Was that treatment effect sustained at later time points? As I mentioned, we looked at 3, 6, 9, and 12 months. And that's looking at this part of the chart. And you can see that it doesn't look as good as the earlier scores. But for this one, we used a statistical test called a test of non-inferiority, and which is checking to see if the results at that earlier time point are sustained, if they're non-inferior to the earlier time points. And what we found was that the improvement that was evident in 3 areas, drug use, legal and family and social status, were all maintained. So, and the psychiatric scores were all maintained too, but as you saw, they were just outside of the level of the 0.05 level of significance. So to summarize our major findings, that Ibogaine is effective for detox. We saw reductions in drug use severity that lasted for 12 months. And we also saw long-term improvement in the social and family status. And that was the second most robust finding that we had. And to me, this is very important, because this is about how well people are getting along with others in their lives, the people that matter most to them, family members and close friends. So there have been a few other studies that have been done pretty recently. This is a mirror study that was done, also supported by MAPS. And this was done in New Zealand. And it had virtually the same methodology as our study. And this one has shown. This was also published at the same time as ours. It's back to back with ours in the 2018 January publication that came out in the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse. This is also showing really good efficacy in the detox and in drug use severity scores, and also significant reduction in the psychiatric severity scores. So a little bit different from our results. But interestingly, the problem drug here, the main problem drugs in the US are heroin and the prescription opioids, whereas in New Zealand, the main problem drug is methadone. So this Brazilian study that came out in 2014 shows it also works for cocaine dependents. These are people who were primarily cocaine users and also some polydrug users, and they were detoxed before treatment. So after one month after detox, they were given Ibogaine, and their analysis showed that after Ibogaine treatment, their periods of abstinence were much longer than the periods of abstinence they were able to achieve before treatment. So, okay, so I got 5. Oh, okay, okay, great. All right, great. So, the data looked pretty good, and if I had more time, what I would do is talk about comparing our results to the standard treatment results. And if you want to have the details on that, go to our paper. It's available for free online, and we have those comparisons there. But they compare very favorably with opioid replacement therapy. But there are certainly areas for improvement. There are certainly ways we can do better than this. And as I showed you, most people are going to relapse even with Ibogaine treatment. So at 1 month, we had 50% of people who were abstinent from opioids after treatment, which is very good, but it also indicates that we probably had 50% of people who had relapsed or just couldn't reach them that month. And by 3 months, most people are going to relapse. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that there's very little aftercare involved with Ibogaine treatment. The typical scenario is that somebody, at least in the Mexican clinics, is that somebody from the United States travels to San Diego or some border town and then goes to Mexico for their treatment. And then after their treatment can sometimes be a couple of days, and it might be a week, and then they're flying back to their home, whether it's in New York City or in Alabama in the US. And so And there's very little follow-up done. And this is an area that's just really rich for improvement in these results. And I also just want to contrast it very briefly with the Bwiti situation, and my colleague Dr. Clark is going to talk about this in much more detail. But the anthropologists Fernandez and Fernandez suggested that one big difference between the Ibogaine context and the Bwiti context is that there's this social support. And also in the Bwiti context, when you're taking part in the rituals, if you're not the initiate, you're still taking smaller doses of the iboga root bark, and so you're effectively getting repeated small doses. And this has been shown anecdotally to work well. People who get more than one treatment do better than people who get one treatment and with Ibogaine. So booster doses, as they're called, can be very helpful. And the other point that I wanted to make on this is that these clinics are unregulated. Some of them are very good, and some of them are sketchy. And you've got to have some things in place. And I imagine that my colleague Dr. Camlett will discuss this in his talk in a little while this afternoon. But you may have heard that there have been deaths at Ibogaine clinics, you have to do proper screenings for people for heart conditions and for their metabolism of Ibogaine. To increase the safety. It can be really rough if you try to find a place. You go on the internet and you try to find the Ibogaine treatment center. You'll find all sorts of results, but it's very hard to tell which one's good and which one's not. So there's a lot of room for improvement there as well. Do I have any more time? Okay, great. Okay, cool. So I also want to talk about barriers to access. So there are, aside from there being ways that we can improve the Ibogaine treatment scenario, the milieu for Ibogaine treatment, there are barriers to access. So if you're looking for, having Ibogaine treatment available to everybody, here are some significant barriers. One is that there are legal barriers. So in the United States, and I assume in Sweden, many European countries, and a few other countries, Ibogaine is illegal. So you can't get treatment, at least not above ground. You might get somebody treating you in a hotel room, or in a setting where it's illegal, and that's not optimal for many reasons. There are also geographical barriers. So if you don't live in a country where there is legal access to Ibogaine treatment, then it's much more difficult to get that treatment. And there are also financial barriers. I haven't looked at this very recently, but back in 2014, when I was looking into the cost and the availability of Ibogaine treatment, I was told that it was around 6,000 US dollars, which is around 70,000 Swedish kroner. I'm not sure, but that's relatively cheap. Yeah. Okay. So and this is a big reason why, in our study, I'll show you some data on that in a minute, but this is a big reason why that in our study, almost everyone who went to receive treatment at the two sites that I was recruiting people from, they were American citizens, and the locals, the Mexicans, who were also in need of Ibogaine treatment, who are in need of some kind of treatment, only very rarely received the treatment. So it's a very kind of backward situation in that regard. So who has access to Ibogaine treatment? People in countries where it's legal, people who can afford the treatment, people who can afford to travel and who can get a passport, and people who can take some time off from work to get the treatment. So here's something on the demographics from our study, just showing how kind of stilted this is. 25 out of 30 were male, 27 out of 30, 90% Caucasian, and they're all residents of the US. Of the 67 people who were treated at these clinics over the recruitment period, 59 of them were were residents of the US. So you can see that the average education was some college education. How am I doing on time? Okay, great. So we do have evidence that it's effective, right? But we don't know, despite some, a number of preclinical studies, we don't know what the mechanism of action is. We do know, however, that ibogaine and its primary metabolite, noribogaine, are active at many receptor sites simultaneously. There have been some proposals about how it works, including increased production of glial-derived neurotrophic factor, but nobody's really made any definitive statement about this. Something that I've been much more interested in recently, since I've finished the study, and that my colleague and I, Dr. Clark, have been looking into recently, is do the psychoactive effects matter? And my bias is yes, they do, and that's partly because I've been interviewing people about their experiences, and they tell me that they were really profound, right? But also, if you look at, here are the differences between if you have an ibogaine treatment and you're detoxed with ibogaine versus if you're detoxed with, say, methadone. It's a good comparison, right? And the results that we're showing are quite good, and are, more importantly, the long-term results after detox are even better than standard treatment. So what's making that difference? I suggest it's probably the psychoactive effects from ibogaine. Ibogaine's psychoactive effects are kind of like a waking dream state. This is a picture that was drawn. This is a drawing from somebody in the study. We had them do what we call a brief description, and some people would write about their experience and had some very moving things. This is a person who just, was all over the place and trying to describe the visuals from and some of the feelings that came up during the experience. So there are some they're very visual experiences, usually, for I think 6 to 8 hours or so. And it's kind of like a waking dream state. Oftentimes it's a highly dense succession of complex and elaborate images. Sometimes people say the images went by so fast that they couldn't really remember them very well. They can include a life review, so they might remember something from their life that they've even forgotten about for a while, or they might remember something that was important to them. And they might have visions of alternate pasts or possible futures. And sometimes they'll have less personal kinds of things like cartoons or archetypal imagery. So I'm going to finish by reading a few quotes from the people in the study that I found powerful. And this is really what we're exploring moving forward, is what are the effects, what are the transformative effects of the ibogaine treatment. So this person, this is showing insight into the roots of addiction, which is one of the common themes we see in these narratives. And this person said, I'd acquired from Dad a relentless and very negative voice in my head. During my journey, this voice left me. It was extraordinary. It was like a tape loop in my head broke, and the tape spun off into space. It was so noticeable that I could sense the space in my mind that was freed up by its departure. I was able to stop that and open myself up to real love for maybe the first time in my adult life. Some people will have these visions of alternate pasts or presents or possible futures. Here are a few of those. One person says, at the final part of my trip, I realized why I was in a self-destructive pattern. Then, for what felt like hours, I saw my future as a heroin addict. I was in and out of prison for a long time, till I was old and decrepit and alone. I felt like I'd wasted my whole life. Then I was under a collapsing bridge, and it fell on me, and I died. Another person who his brother was also treated with Ibogaine. He had unrecognized alcoholism. His brother, this person was treated for opioid dependence. And he said, the Ibogaine showed me that if I continued on opiates, I would someday be smuggling heroin into Florida, and they were going to get a yacht and smuggle cocaine into Florida, or heroin into Florida. And he saw himself having an affair with his brother's wife and then murdering his brother. And as you can imagine, these are very powerful scenes for people that, they're compelling. So, and this one is another theme that came up in the narratives, and that is reconciliation and forgiveness. And in this context, I want to remind you that the second most robust finding we had in our ASI scores was that the family and social status improved considerably over the entire 12-month period following treatment. So one person says that during his experience, I felt a profound sense of love for my family and their love for me in an intense, almost piercing agony as I was overwhelmed with the remorse and the waste and loss, feeling empathy with my family over all their hopes for me, dashed by my relentless pursuit of drugs. And this one on the bottom here, this is somebody who came from a broken family. He experienced severe abuse at the hands of his parents. His father was the first person who shot him up with heroin when he was 15 years old. He lived on the streets for a long time, had suicide attempts, numerous suicide attempts, and then he had treatment. And he says on the 10th day after the start of my treatment, this is 10 days after his treatment, which is interesting too, while still at the clinic, I woke up and realized suddenly that all of my life experiences made me who I am today. And with that realization, I totally forgave my mother and my father. Before Ibogaine, I hated my father. Now I'm thankful for all that I learned from him. So I want to end with this quote from Howard Lotsoff and Boz Vachtel, who wrote the manual for Ibogaine therapy. Ibogaine's value is not only in the interruption of withdrawal, but by mechanisms not fully understood to assist the patient in changing learned behavior and becoming more aware of their behavior in order to change it. After Ibogaine therapy, many patients become more agreeable to change. So, and I also have to thank a number of people, including my colleague Dr. Clark and my co-author Kenneth Alper. So, thank you.